Sold at auction as worthless, Apache Girl was treated like property until a cowboy called her his wife. The rope burns on her wrists had stopped bleeding 3 days ago, but the humiliation still burned fresh as morning coffee. 20-year-old Ayana pressed her back against the weathered wooden post, watching dust devils dance across the auction yard while men in worn hats discussed her fate like they would a lame horse. She understood every word they spoke, though they assumed otherwise. 4 years of living among white settlers had taught her their language, their customs, their cruelty. The auctioneer's voice carried across the Arizona Territory heat, describing her as though she were livestock. The year was 1878, and the town of Prescott buzzed with the usual mix of miners, ranchers, and drifters seeking fortune in the unforgiving desert. Adobe buildings lined the main street, their flat roofs baking under the relentless sun that had already climbed high despite the early hour. Wooden sidewalks creaked under boots, and the constant sound of hammering echoed from the growing settlement as more structures rose to house the influx of newcomers. Ayana had been born to the Chiricahua Apache, raised in the sacred mountains where her grandmother taught her to read the sky for weather and the earth for sustenance. Her childhood had been filled with the songs of her people, the taste of acorn cakes, and the safety of belonging somewhere. That life had ended when soldiers raided her village, separating children from families in the name of civilization and progress. Now she stood on a platform built for selling cattle, her dark hair braided simply, wearing a faded blue dress that hung loose on her slender frame. The dress had been given to her at the government school where they had tried to strip away everything that made her Apache. They had failed in most ways, but succeeded in making her an outsider to both worlds. The crowd gathering below consisted mainly of ranchers and businessmen, their faces weathered by sun and hard living. Some looked at her with the calculating eyes of men evaluating a work animal. Others showed the uncomfortable shuffling of people witnessing something that sat poorly with their consciences, yet did nothing to stop it. Among them stood a figure that immediately caught her attention. Tall and lean, with dark hair that needed cutting and clothes that spoke of honest work rather than wealth, he seemed different from the others. His name was Ezekiel Morrison, though most called him Zeke. At 30 years old, he had already lived more than many men twice his age. Zeke owned a modest ranch 20 miles north of Prescott, carved from land that demanded respect rather than conquest. He had come to town not for the auction, but to purchase supplies and visit the bank about extending his loan. The sight of a young woman being sold like property had stopped him cold in the dusty street. His ranch consisted of a simple wooden house he had built himself, a barn that housed his 6 horses and corrals that contained the small herd of cattle he was struggling to expand. The land stretched across rolling hills dotted with juniper and oak, crossed by a creek that ran clear most of the year. It was not grand, but it was his own, earned through back-breaking work and stubborn determination. The auctioneer, a portly man named Garrison, who made his living from other people's desperation, climbed onto a wooden crate to address the crowd. His voice boomed across the yard, practiced in the art of making the unwanted seem valuable. "Gentlemen, we have here a fine example of Indian domestication. This young woman has been educated in the Christian ways at the territorial school. She can cook, clean, and has proven herself manageable, perfect for household duties or whatever other needs might arise." Ayana's jaw tightened at the words, but she kept her expression neutral. Showing emotion would only make things worse. She had learned that lesson repeatedly during her years of captivity, first at the government school and later as unpaid help in various households around the territory. The bidding began low, as it always did for human cargo. $5, $10. The amounts felt obscene, not because they were high, but because they were so pitifully small. Her entire existence reduced to less than the cost of a decent horse. Zeke found himself unable to move away from the scene, despite every instinct telling him to mind his own business. He had come to Arizona Territory to start fresh after losing everything in Kansas to drought and debt. The last thing he needed was complications, especially ones that involved defying social conventions and taking on responsibilities he could barely afford. Yet something about the young woman's dignity in the face of such degradation struck him like a physical blow. She stood straight back despite the rope marks on her wrists, her dark eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the crowd. There was no pleading in her expression, no attempt to make herself appealing to potential buyers. She simply endured, and that quiet strength reminded him of the Apache warriors he had encountered during his years as a cavalry scout. The bidding continued, creeping upward dollar by dollar. A rancher named Hutchins, known for his harsh treatment of hired hands, seemed particularly interested. His ranch was notorious for dangerous working conditions and workers who disappeared without explanation. The thought of this young woman ending up in his hands made Zeke's stomach turn. $25, $30. The amounts remained insultingly low. But for men looking for cheap labor, even these sums represented a calculated investment. Ayanna would work without wages, sleep wherever she was told, and have no legal recourse if mistreated. In their minds, she was property, plain and simple. The sun climbed higher, turning the auction yard into an oven. Sweat stained the shirts of the bidders, and several men retreated to the shade of nearby buildings. Ayanna remained motionless on the platform, though Zeke could see the slight tremor in her hands that betrayed her fear. Hutchins raised his bid to $35, his voice carrying the confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. The auctioneer looked around for competing offers, his gavel ready to fall and seal the young woman's fate. That was when Zeke heard his own voice calling out a bid of $50. The crowd turned to look at him, surprise evident on their faces. $50 was more than most of them made in a month, and certainly more than anyone expected to pay for Indian labor. Hutchins scowled in his direction, clearly annoyed at having his easy purchase complicated. Zeke felt every eye in the yard focused on him, but he kept his gaze fixed on the auctioneer. He had no clear plan beyond preventing Hutchins from winning the bid. No idea what he would do with a young Apache woman if he succeeded. All he knew was that walking away now felt impossible. The auctioneer, delighted by the unexpected jump in bidding, called for higher offers. Hutchins countered with $55, his jaw set in determination. Other bidders began to lose interest as the price climbed beyond what they considered reasonable for household help. $60, Zeke responded, his voice steady despite the racing of his heart. The money represented a significant portion of his savings, funds he had intended to use for expanding his herd and improving his ranch. But looking at Ayanna's face, seeing the subtle shift in her expression as she realized someone was willing to bid seriously for her freedom, he knew he could not stop now. Hutchins glared across the crowd, his face reddening with anger. The man was not accustomed to being outbid, especially by a small rancher of modest means. He called out $70, his voice tight with irritation. The bidding war had captured the attention of the entire crowd. People emerged from nearby buildings to see what was causing the commotion, drawn by the unusual spectacle of two men fighting over the price of an Apache girl. Conversation stopped as everyone focused on the drama unfolding in the dusty yard. Zeke felt the weight of every dollar he was bidding, knowing that each increase put his ranch closer to financial disaster. Yet he could not bring himself to stop. Something in Ayanna's bearing, in her refusal to be broken despite her circumstances, demanded that he continue. $80. The words left his mouth before he fully considered their implications. $80 would leave him with barely enough money to make his next loan payment, would force him to survive on beans and hardtack for months. But it might also be enough to outbid Hutchins, whose interest seemed to be wavering as the price climbed beyond reason. Hutchins hesitated, looking around the crowd as if seeking support for his continued bidding. The pause stretched long enough for the auctioneer to call for final offers, his gavel poised to seal the sale. Sold to the gentleman in the brown hat for $80. The crack of the gavel echoed across the yard like a gunshot. finalizing a transaction that would change two lives forever. Zeke felt a mixture of relief and terror wash over him as he realized what he had just done. He had purchased a human being, something that went against every principle he claimed to hold dear. Yet as he watched Ayana's shoulders relax slightly, saw the smallest hint of hope flicker in her dark eyes, he knew he had made the only choice he could live with. The practical consequences would have to sort themselves out later. The crowd began to disperse, most people returning to their business now that the entertainment was over. Hutchins pushed through the group toward Zeke, his face twisted with anger and something darker. "You just made a big mistake, Morrison. That squaw will bring you nothing but trouble. Should have let a man who knows how to handle Indians take her off your hands." Zeke met the older man's glare without flinching, though his hand instinctively moved closer to the gun on his hip. Hutchins had a reputation for holding grudges, and making an enemy of him was dangerous in a territory where law enforcement was sporadic at best. "I reckon that is my business to worry about," Zeke replied calmly, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had faced down worse threats than an angry rancher. Hutchins spat into the dust at Zeke's feet before stalking away, his departure leaving a tension in the air that several onlookers seemed to feel. Making enemies in Arizona territory was easy. Living long enough to regret it was considerably harder. The auctioneer approached with the necessary paperwork, his manner now obsequious in the face of such an unexpectedly profitable sale. He handed over a document that officially transferred ownership of one Apache female, age approximately 20 years, to Ezekiel Morrison of Prescott County. The paper felt obscene in Zeke's hands, a legal representation of something that should never have existed. He folded it quickly and tucked it into his shirt pocket, trying not to think too deeply about what it represented. Ayana was led down from the platform by one of the auctioneer's assistants, her movements careful and controlled. Up close, Zeke could see the intelligence in her dark eyes, the way she observed everything around her with the alertness of someone who had learned to survive by reading danger in the smallest details. She stood before him now, this young woman whose life he had just purchased for the price of a good horse. Neither spoke for a long moment, the weight of their new circumstances settling between them like dust after a windstorm. The town around them continued its daily rhythm, oblivious to the magnitude of what had just occurred. Wagons rolled down the main street, their wheels raising clouds of dirt that would settle on everything by evening. Children played in the spaces between buildings, their laughter a stark contrast to the somber business that had just concluded. Zeke finally found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended. "My name is Ezekiel Morrison. I have a ranch north of here." Ayana studied his face for a long moment before responding, her voice carrying an accent that mixed Apache inflections with careful English pronunciation. "I am called Ayana by my people. The white school named me Sarah, but that is not who I am." The simple statement contained layers of meaning that Zeke was only beginning to understand. Here was a woman caught between worlds, claimed by neither, reduced to property by circumstances beyond her control. Yet in her choice to give him her real name rather than the one imposed by her captors, he heard defiance and hope in equal measure. "Ayana," he repeated, testing the unfamiliar syllables. "That is a fine name." She nodded once, a gesture that seemed to acknowledge something passing between them. Not friendship, certainly not trust, but perhaps the beginning of mutual respect. The practical reality of their situation began to assert itself as the auction yard emptied around them. Zeke had a young Apache woman in his custody, legal ownership papers in his pocket, and no clear idea what to do next. His ranch was a day's ride from town, and he had not prepared for a traveling companion, especially one whose presence would raise questions and complications throughout the territory. The supplies he had come to purchase still waited at the general store, along with the banking business that had brought him to Prescott in the first place. But those concerns seemed trivial now compared to the immediate question of how to proceed with Ayana. She seemed to sense his uncertainty, her dark eyes taking in his weathered clothes, the careful way he counted coins, the modest horse and simple saddle that marked him as a man of limited means. Whatever she had expected from her new owner, it clearly had not been this uncertain rancher who seemed as surprised by his actions as anyone. "You did not plan to buy me," she observed, her voice stating fact rather than asking a question. Zeke could not deny the truth in her words. "No, I did not plan it. I came to town for supplies and saw." He gestured toward the empty auction platform, struggling to find words for what he had witnessed. "You saw them selling a human being like cattle, and it bothered you." Again, her tone carried no judgment, only observation. "It did bother me. Still does." He met her eyes directly, wanting her to understand that whatever happened next, he saw her as a person, not property. The admission hung in the air between them, honest and complicated. Around them, Prescott continued its daily business, but for Zeke and Ayanna, everything had changed in the space of a single auction. The sun reached its zenith, turning the main street into a furnace that drove most people into whatever shade they could find. Zeke realized they could not continue standing in the open discussing their situation, especially with curious eyes beginning to focus on the unusual pair. "I need to finish my business in town," he said finally. "Then we will ride to my ranch. You will be safe there." Safe. The word carried promises he hoped he could keep, implications that stretched far beyond simple physical protection. In a territory where Apache raids still occurred and tensions between settlers and natives ran high, harboring an Apache woman would mark him as suspect in many eyes. But as he looked at Ayanna, seeing the careful way she held herself, the dignity she maintained despite everything that had been done to her, Zeke knew there was no turning back. Whatever consequences awaited, he would face them rather than abandon her to a fate worse than what she had already endured. They walked together toward the general store, an unlikely pair that drew stares and whispered comments from passers-by. Zeke ignored the attention, focusing instead on the practical needs of the journey ahead. Food, water, perhaps a better dress for Ayanna to replace the worn garment that marked her as recently auctioned property. The general store was dim and cool after the blazing street, its shelves stocked with everything from canned goods to farm tools. The proprietor, a thin man named Kellerman, looked up from his ledger book with the expression of someone expecting routine business. His demeanor changed when he saw Ayanna, his eyes widening slightly before narrowing with disapproval. Word of the auction had already spread through the small community, and Kellerman clearly recognized her as the Apache girl who had just been sold. "Help you with something, Morrison?" His tone was cooler than usual, professional but lacking warmth. Zeke had expected this reaction, had known that his actions at the auction would change how people in town viewed him. Still, the immediate shift in treatment stung more than he had anticipated. "Need supplies for the ride home," he said simply, beginning to gather items from the shelves. Hardtack, coffee, dried beans, ammunition for his rifle. Basic necessities that would see them through the journey and the days immediately following. Ayanna stood quietly near the door, her presence seeming to make everyone in the store uncomfortable. A woman shopping for fabric hurried her children past, whispering sharp warnings about staying close. Two men who had been discussing cattle prices fell silent, their conversation replaced by watchful tension. The social dynamics of the frontier were playing out in miniature within the confines of the general store. Zeke's decision to purchase Ayanna had marked him as different, possibly dangerous, certainly unpredictable. In a community where survival often depended on knowing where everyone stood, his actions had introduced an uncomfortable variable. He completed his purchases in relative silence, paying for supplies with coins that represented a significant portion of his remaining money. Kellerman counted the payment carefully, his manner suggesting that he wanted the transaction completed as quickly as possible. As they prepared to leave, Zeke paused near a display of women's clothing. Simple dresses, practical rather than fashionable, but clean and whole. He selected one in dark green cloth, estimating Ayana's size as best he could. "She will need proper clothes," he said to Kellerman, his tone daring the man to object. The proprietor wrapped the dress in brown paper without comment, adding its cost to the growing total. Other customers in the store watched the transaction with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Outside, the heat struck them like a physical blow after the relative coolness of the store. Zeke loaded his purchases into saddlebags, distributing weight carefully between his horse and the pack mule he had brought for carrying supplies. The banking business he had planned to conduct would have to wait for another trip to town. His circumstances had changed too dramatically to risk extending his loan under these new conditions. Better to struggle with existing debt than to complicate matters further. Ayana watched his preparations with the attention of someone learning crucial information. She observed how he secured the loads, the care he took with his weapons, the way he constantly scanned their surroundings for potential threats. These were survival skills that transcended cultural boundaries. "Can you ride?" he asked, realizing he should have determined this earlier. "Yes, my people are born on horseback." Her slight smile suggested amusement at the question, though not mockery. Zeke felt heat rise in his cheeks at his own ignorance. Of course she could ride. The Apache were renowned as some of the finest horsemen on the continent, capable of traveling vast distances across terrain that would challenge most cavalry units. He had brought only one riding horse, expecting to make the journey alone. The pack mule could carry Ayana, though it would not be comfortable for the long ride ahead. Another oversight in his impulsive decision to bid at the auction. As if reading his thoughts, Ayana moved toward the mule with easy confidence. She examined the animal's condition, running experienced hands along its legs and checking its hooves with the skill of someone who understood that a lame mount in desert country meant death. "This one is sound," she announced. "She will carry me without complaint." Her easy competence with the animal surprised Zeke, though he realized it should not have. Everything about Ayana suggested capabilities that went far beyond the domestic skills the auctioneer had advertised. She was clearly someone who had learned to survive in harsh conditions long before her capture. They mounted their respective animals as the afternoon sun began its slow descent toward the western mountains. The ride to Zeke's ranch would take them through country that was both beautiful and dangerous, where Apache raiding parties still moved despite government efforts to contain them on reservations. The irony of the situation was not lost on either of them. A white rancher and an Apache woman, traveling together through territory where their peoples had fought bloody wars for generations. Yet here they were, bound together by circumstances neither had planned, heading into an uncertain future with nothing but hope and stubborn determination to guide them. As they rode out of Prescott, leaving behind the curious stares and whispered conversations, both Zeke and Ayana were aware that they were crossing more than just physical distance. They were entering territory where the old rules no longer applied, where they would have to create new ways of living that honored both of their backgrounds while building something entirely unprecedented. The desert stretched ahead of them, vast and unforgiving, but also filled with the possibility of transformation. In the growing heat of the afternoon, they began their journey toward whatever future awaited at the end of the dusty trail. The first hours of their ride passed in relative silence, both riders adjusting to the rhythm of travel and the weight of unspoken questions that hung between them like the dust clouds their animals kicked up. The trail wound through juniper-dotted hills, following ancient paths that had been worn smooth by countless generations of travelers. Ayana rode with the natural grace of her people, her body moving in perfect harmony with the mule's gait. Despite the animal's reputation for stubbornness, it responded to her guidance with surprising cooperation, as if recognizing a kindred spirit who understood the harsh realities of desert survival. Zeke found himself stealing glances at his unexpected companion, trying to reconcile the dignified woman beside him with the property he had legally purchased just hours earlier. The very idea of owning another human being made his stomach churn, Yet he could think of no other way he might have freed her from Hutchins and his ilk. The sun beat down mercilessly as they climbed higher into the foothills, the temperature climbing well past what most folks could comfortably endure. Yet neither rider showed signs of distress, both having learned through necessity to conserve energy and water during the punishing heat of Arizona afternoons. Wild country stretched in every direction, broken only by the occasional hawks circling overhead and the distant mountains that promised cooler air and fresh water. This was land that demanded respect, where a moment of carelessness or a wrong turn could mean the difference between reaching safety and becoming another set of bones bleached white by the relentless sun. As the afternoon wore on, Zeke began to recognize landmarks that meant they were entering his territory. A distinctive rock formation shaped like a crouching wolf, a creek bed that would run full during the spring snowmelt, fence posts that marked the boundary of his modest spread. "We are close now," he said, the first words either had spoken since leaving Prescott. Ayanna nodded, her dark eyes scanning the terrain with the practiced awareness of someone who had spent a lifetime reading the subtle signs that spelled safety or danger in wild places. She could see why this man had chosen to build his life in such remote country, far from the complications and judgments of town life. The ranch house appeared as they crested a small rise, a simple structure of weathered wood and stone that seemed to grow naturally from the landscape around it. Smoke rose from the chimney despite the heat, and chickens scattered as their horses approached the main yard. A dog emerged from the shade of the porch, tail wagging cautiously as it investigated these unexpected arrivals. The animal showed no aggression toward Ayanna, though Zeke had worried about how his livestock might react to the scent of someone from a different culture. "Welcome to Morrison Ranch," Zeke said simply, dismounting near the hitching post he had carved from a fallen oak tree. Ayanna slid down from the mule with fluid grace, her moccasined feet touching the hard-packed earth of the ranch yard. She stood for a moment, taking in her new surroundings with the careful assessment of someone who had learned never to trust first impressions. The ranch was modest but well-maintained, speaking of a man who took pride in his work despite limited resources. The house itself was built from local stone and timber, its design practical rather than decorative. A covered porch ran along the front, providing shade during the brutal summer months and protection from winter storms. Behind the main house stood a sturdy barn, its doors hanging open to reveal the dark coolness within. She could smell hay and leather, hear the soft nickering of horses settling in for the evening. Corrals stretched beyond the barn, containing a small herd of cattle that had gathered near the water trough. The land itself rolled away in gentle hills covered with hardy grass and dotted with oak and juniper. A creek ran along the eastern boundary, its presence marked by the greener vegetation that flourished near its banks. It was good country, the kind that would support a family if worked with intelligence and determination. Zeke began unsaddling his horse, his movements economical and practiced. The animal stood quietly, accustomed to the routine of homecoming after long days away from the ranch. Steam rose from its flanks in the cooling afternoon air, and Zeke's hands moved gently as he removed the heavy saddle and bridle. "The horses need tending first," he said, glancing toward Ayanna. "Everything else can wait until they are properly cared for." She nodded approval at this priority, recognizing the wisdom of a man who understood that his survival depended on the health of his animals. In Apache culture, horses were treasured beyond almost any other possession, partners in survival rather than mere tools. Without being asked, she began removing the pack saddle from the mule, her hands moving with the same practiced efficiency Zeke had shown with his mount. The animal stood calmly under her ministrations, seeming to sense that these hands knew their business. Together they led the animals toward the barn, their footsteps raising small puffs of dust in the dry earth. The interior of the structure was well organized, with stalls for 6 horses, a tack room filled with carefully maintained leather goods, and a loft overhead where fresh hay released its sweet scent into the cooling air. Zeke showed her where to find feed and water, explaining his routine for caring for the animals without any assumption that she would not understand. His manner was respectful, teacher to student rather than master to property, and Ayana found herself cautiously appreciating this unexpected consideration. As they worked, she became aware of the sounds that filled the evening air around the ranch. Cattle lowing in the distance, the rustle of chickens settling for the night, the whisper of wind through the oak trees that shaded the house. It was peaceful in a way she had not experienced since her childhood in the Apache camps, before soldiers had shattered her world. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains when they finished with the animals, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed to set the entire landscape ablaze. The temperature was finally beginning to drop from the punishing heat of midday, though the air still shimmered with stored warmth. Zeke secured the barn doors and turned toward the house, pausing as if uncertain how to proceed. The reality of their situation was settling over both of them now that the immediate tasks were complete. He had brought an Apache woman to his isolated ranch, purchased her like livestock, and now had to figure out what came next. "You must be hungry," he said finally, stating the obvious as a way of moving forward. "I can prepare something simple." Ayana studied his face, reading the uncertainty there along with something that looked like genuine concern for her welfare. It was not what she had expected from a man who had bought her at auction, regardless of his motivations for outbidding Hutchins. "I can cook," she said quietly. "My grandmother taught me to prepare meals from whatever could be found or caught. The white school tried to teach me their ways as well." The offer hung between them, practical yet laden with implications. Accepting would mean acknowledging some level of partnership rather than the master-servant relationship that the law said existed between them. Refusing might seem like rejection of her attempt to contribute. Zeke considered for a moment, then nodded. "I would be grateful for the help. My cooking tends toward the basic side of things." They walked toward the house together, the dog trotting alongside with the easy acceptance of an animal that sensed no threat from these new arrivals. The porch boards creaked under their feet, worn smooth by years of use and weather. The interior of the house was as practical as its exterior, furnished with handmade pieces built for durability rather than appearance. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth blackened by countless cooking fires. Simple furniture filled the main room, everything arranged for comfort and utility. The kitchen area occupied one corner, equipped with a wood-burning stove and a table scarred by years of meal preparation. Shelves held dishes, cooking implements, and jars of preserved foods that would see a man through the long winter months when fresh supplies were impossible to obtain. Ayana moved through the space with careful observation, noting the locations of knives, the quality of the cookware, the types of food available. Not because she planned any harm, but because understanding her environment was essential for survival in any new situation. Zeke watched her exploration, trying to see his modest home through her eyes. It was clean but Spartan, the dwelling of a man who spent most of his time outdoors and had little patience for domestic refinements. Suddenly he felt embarrassed by its simplicity, wondering what she thought of these rough accommodations. "It is not much," he said, his voice carrying an apology. "It is honest," she replied, running her hand along the smooth surface of the kitchen table. "Made by someone who understands the value of good work." The simple compliment affected him more than elaborate praise might have. She had seen through the modest exterior to appreciate the care and skill that had gone into creating this home from raw materials and determination. As evening deepened around them, they began the delicate process of learning to share space, to navigate the complex dynamics of their unusual situation. Neither knew exactly what the future would bring, but both understood that their lives had been permanently altered by the events of this single day. The first night would test them both, setting patterns that would determine whether this unlikely partnership could survive the challenges that surely lay ahead. The first meal they shared was a quiet affair, marked by careful politeness and the weight of unspoken questions. Ayanna had prepared a simple stew from dried beef and vegetables she found in Zeke's larder, seasoning it with wild herbs she recognized from the plants growing near his creek. The familiar flavors connected her to memories of her grandmother's cooking, bringing unexpected comfort to the strange new situation. Zeke ate with genuine appreciation, surprised by how much better his basic ingredients tasted when prepared by someone who understood the subtle art of combining flavors. They sat across from each other at his handmade table, the lamplight casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. "This is very good," he said, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. "Much better than my usual attempts." Ayanna nodded acknowledgement of the compliment, but her mind was wrestling with larger concerns than cooking. The legal document in Zeke's pocket made her his property, yet his behavior suggested he saw her as something more. This contradiction created an uncertainty that was both hopeful and terrifying. After the meal, the practical question of sleeping arrangements had to be addressed. Zeke's small house had only one bedroom, and the implications of their situation weighed heavily on both of them. He had purchased her at auction, which in the minds of many men would have granted him certain rights over her person. "There is a spare room," he said awkwardly, gesturing toward a door she had not yet explored. "It is not much, but it has a proper bed and can be made comfortable." Relief flooded through Ayanna at these words, though she was careful not to let it show too clearly on her face. She had feared that this man, no matter how different he seemed from Hutchins, might still expect the same things that many men would consider their due from purchased property. The spare room was indeed modest, containing a simple iron bed frame, a wooden chest, and a small window that looked out toward the eastern hills. Clean but clearly unused for some time, it carried the musty smell of a space that had been closed off from regular habitation. "I will make it suitable," she said, examining the room with the practical eye of someone accustomed to making the best of whatever shelter was available. That night, as she lay on the unfamiliar bed listening to the sounds of this new place, Ayanna allowed herself to consider the possibility that her life might have taken an unexpected turn toward something better. The rancher who had bought her freedom seemed different from the white men she had encountered during her years of captivity, but she had learned not to trust too quickly or completely. The days that followed established a routine that surprised them both with its naturalness. Ayanna proved herself invaluable around the ranch, her skills extending far beyond the domestic duties the auctioneer had advertised. She could track wounded cattle through difficult terrain, identify plants that were safe for both human and animal consumption, and predict weather changes with an accuracy that amazed Zeke. In return, he treated her with a respect that gradually eroded her defensive barriers. He asked for her opinions on ranch matters, listened when she suggested better ways to accomplish tasks, and never once used the legal ownership he held over her as a weapon to compel obedience. 3 weeks into their arrangement, a problem arose that would test the foundations of their developing relationship. Zeke's neighbor to the south, a rancher named Crawford who ran a much larger operation, rode up to the house one morning with news that set both their hearts racing. "Morrison, you need to know that Hutchins has been spreading talk around town about you and that Indian girl you bought," Crawford said without preamble, his weathered face grim with concern. "He is claiming you are harboring a potential spy, someone who might be passing information to Apache raiders still operating in the territory." The accusation was both absurd and dangerous. While Ayanna had been separated from her people for years and had no contact with any Apache bands, the mere suggestion of such connections could bring territorial authorities to investigate, or worse, vigilante justice from settlers who had lost family to raids. Zeke felt anger rise in his chest at Hutchins' vindictiveness, but he kept his voice level when he responded. "Hutchins is angry that I outbid him at the auction. This is nothing more than spite." Crawford shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, clearly reluctant to deliver the rest of his message. There is more, Zeke. He is also suggesting that your relationship with her goes beyond what is proper, that you are treating property like a wife. Some folks in town are getting worked up about it. The implications were clear and threatening. In a territory where social conventions were enforced as much by community pressure as by law, accusations of impropriety could destroy a man's reputation and livelihood. Worse, they could put Ayanna in danger from people who saw her as the source of the problem. After Crawford left, Zeke found Ayanna working in the vegetable garden she had planted behind the house, tending rows of beans and squash with the patient care her grandmother had taught her. She looked up as he approached, reading the tension in his posture immediately. "There is trouble," she said. It was not a question. He explained Crawford's warning, watching her face for signs of fear or panic. Instead, he saw the same calm alertness she had shown at the auction, the expression of someone who had faced danger before and survived through intelligence rather than panic. "Hutchins seeks revenge for his wounded pride," she said simply. "He will use whatever weapons he can find to strike at you." "I will not let him hurt you," Zeke said, the words carrying a fierce protectiveness that surprised them both with its intensity. Ayanna studied his face, seeing something there that made her pulse quicken despite the dangerous circumstances. Over the weeks they had spent together, she had begun to see this man not as her owner, but as someone who genuinely cared about her welfare. The realization was both wonderful and terrifying. "What will you do?" she asked. Zeke had been considering that question since Crawford's departure, weighing options that all seemed fraught with risk. He could take Ayanna and leave the territory, abandoning everything he had worked to build. He could try to weather the storm of gossip and accusations, hoping that truth would eventually prevail over malice. Or he could take a step that would change everything between them forever. "There is one way to silence Hutchins and protect you from his lies," he said slowly, the words feeling momentous as they left his lips. "If we were married, legally wed, then his accusations would lose their power. A man cannot be criticized for treating his wife with respect." The proposal hung in the air between them like morning mist, beautiful and fragile and potentially transformative. Ayanna felt her breath catch in her throat as she considered the implications of what he was suggesting. Marriage would grant her protection under law, would make her a citizen rather than property. But it would also bind her to this man in ways that went far beyond their current arrangement, creating expectations and obligations that neither had previously contemplated. "You would do this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Marry an Apache woman, knowing what it would cost you in the eyes of your people?" Zeke reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she chose, and took her hands in his. They were calloused from work, strong and capable. Hands that had learned to survive in a harsh world through skill and determination. "Ayanna, these past weeks have shown me something I did not expect when I bought your freedom at that auction. You are not just someone I rescued from a bad situation. You have become important to me in ways I am still learning to understand." The admission was clumsy but heartfelt, carrying the ring of truth that comes from words spoken without calculation or artifice. Ayanna felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of defenses she had maintained since childhood. "I have feelings for you as well," she said softly, the confession feeling both dangerous and liberating. "But marriage between us would bring challenges that go beyond Hutchins and his lies." She was right, and they both knew it. A white rancher married to an Apache woman would face suspicion and hostility from both communities. Their children, if they had any, would belong fully to neither world. The path forward was fraught with difficulties that would test them at every turn. Yet as they stood there in the garden she had planted, hands joined and hearts opening to possibilities neither had dared imagine, both felt that love might be strong enough to overcome even the deepest prejudices of their time and place. "Will you marry me, Ayanna?" Zeke asked formally, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that would shape the rest of their lives. She looked into his eyes, seeing honesty and hope and a love that had grown from respect and daily kindness. In that moment, She chose to trust in a future that defied convention but honored the connection that had developed between them. "Yes," she said simply, "I will marry you." The wedding took place 3 days later in the small church at Prescott, performed by Reverend Williams, who agreed to conduct the ceremony despite his obvious discomfort with the unusual union. Crawford served as witness, along with his wife Martha, both offering their support despite knowing it would bring criticism from others in the community. Ayanna wore the green dress Zeke had purchased for her at the general store, altered to fit her perfectly by Martha Crawford's skillful hands. She had braided her long black hair with ribbons, creating a style that honored both her Apache heritage and her new role as a rancher's wife. The ceremony itself was brief and simple, the traditional words carrying extra weight given the unconventional nature of the couple speaking them. When Reverend Williams pronounced them husband and wife, Zeke kissed Ayanna gently, sealing a bond that transformed her from property to partner in the eyes of the law. The small congregation that witnessed their wedding was divided in their reactions. Some smiled and offered congratulations, moved by the obvious affection between the couple. Others maintained stony silence, their disapproval clear in their rigid postures and averted eyes. Hutchins was notably absent, though his influence could be felt in the whispered conversations that followed the couple as they left the church. The rancher's campaign of gossip and innuendo had failed to prevent the wedding, but it had succeeded in dividing the community into those who supported the unusual marriage and those who saw it as a dangerous precedent. Returning to the ranch as husband and wife brought new dimensions to their relationship that both had anticipated and feared. The legal bond between them had changed nothing of their daily routines, but it had created an emotional intimacy that required careful navigation. That night, for the first time since her arrival, Ayanna moved her belongings into the main bedroom they would now share. The transition was awkward but natural, two people learning to merge their lives in the most fundamental way possible. Zeke was patient and gentle, understanding that trust in marriage, as in all things, had to be earned rather than assumed. Their physical relationship developed slowly, built on the foundation of respect and affection they had already established. The challenges Ayanna had predicted soon materialized in ways both subtle and overt. Shopkeepers in Prescott treated them with cool politeness when they appeared together, their disapproval clear despite their professional courtesy. Some of Zeke's neighbors stopped visiting the ranch, their previous friendships strained by social conventions they could not bring themselves to ignore. More seriously, Zeke began losing cattle to rustlers who seemed to know exactly when and where to strike for maximum impact. Fences were cut in the night, water sources were fouled with debris, and equipment disappeared from his barns with increasing frequency. The harassment was clearly organized, though proving who was behind it remained impossible. Hutchins maintained a careful distance from direct involvement, but his satisfaction at the Morrison Ranch's troubles was evident to anyone who cared to look. 6 months after their wedding, the situation reached a crisis point that would test everything they had built together. Zeke discovered that 20 head of his breeding cattle had been driven off during the night, representing a loss that threatened the financial stability of his operation. Standing in the empty pasture where the cattle should have been grazing, he felt the weight of every decision that had brought him to this moment. His impulsive purchase of Ayanna's freedom, their unconventional marriage, his determination to build a life that defied social expectations, all of it was crumbling under the sustained pressure of community hostility. Ayanna found him there as the sun was setting, painting the empty grassland in shades of gold and crimson. She could read his despair in the slump of his shoulders, the way he stared at the ground instead of meeting her eyes. "We could leave," she said quietly, voicing the option they had both considered but never discussed. "Start over somewhere else where people do not know our story." Zeke looked up at her, seeing the woman who had become the center of his world, the partner whose strength and wisdom had enriched every aspect of his life. The thought of abandoning everything he had built was painful, but the thought of losing her was unbearable. "Is that what you want?" he asked. Ayanna moved closer, taking his hand in hers with the same gentle certainty she had shown on the day they first met. "I want to be wherever you are. But I also want you to fight for what you have built here if you believe it is worth fighting for." Her words crystallized something that had been forming in his mind throughout the long months of harassment and loss. He had been reacting defensively to Hutchins' campaign, trying to weather the storm rather than striking back. But passive resistance was not winning this war. "Then we fight," he said, his voice carrying new determination. "We find out who is stealing our cattle, and we make them pay for what they have taken." The next morning brought an opportunity neither had expected. Crawford rode up to their house with news that changed everything about their situation, setting events in motion that would determine whether their unconventional marriage could survive the ultimate test of adversity. "Zeke, you need to know something," Crawford said, his expression grim with urgency. "I saw Hutchins' men driving a herd toward the territorial border last night. Mixed brands, including some that looked like yours. They are planning to sell stolen cattle across the line where territorial law cannot follow." The information was exactly what Zeke needed to take action against his persecutors, but it also presented dangers that could destroy everything he and Ayanna had built together. Confronting cattle thieves was deadly business, and failure would leave his wife alone and defenseless in a hostile community. Yet as he looked at Ayanna, seeing the fierce determination in her dark eyes, he realized that she was not defenseless at all. She was Apache, raised by a people who had survived against impossible odds through courage and cunning. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The final confrontation was approaching, and with it, the test that would determine whether love truly could conquer the prejudices and hatreds that had shaped the frontier for generations.